Part 12 of The Dragon Scourge by M.R.R. Lopez. Chapter 10, The Knight's Path. Steel blades clashed, and the sound of men dying rang out through the valley, while the priests in red robes rushed to shackle the children to the great stone pillars. The Clove realized that the soldiers would make it certain that the Black Knight would not break them free. Seeing his chance, and seeing a perfect distraction, he hurried down the mountainside. He didn't know what to do, but this had to stop, and this was his only opening. He was not going to allow this to happen, not while he drew breath. Creela put her hands over her mouth as she watched her childhood guardian crush her father's most trusted men. She turned away and rode into the stone circle, where the priest took her horse's reins and helped her down. Then she held out her hands to be bound, and they somberly escorted her to the granite altar in the center of the circle. The soldiers were not able to stop Shadow from entering the great stone circle. The princess watched as the Dark Knight, with his sword dripping with blood, stretched out his hand toward her, but she spat at him. "Get away from me! You're a traitor and a murderer!" she cried, and suddenly the sky darkened. The villagers, the remaining soldiers, and even the priests fled from the stone circle as the drums began to play, and everyone began to chant. "Dragon of the Valley! Dragon of wealth! Dragon of prosperity! Accept our offerings! Give us peace! Give us protection! Bring new life to your sacred valley!" Over the chanting villagers, the Clove heard the sound of a great rushing wind, as if a storm were brewing, but there was no cloud in the sky. He looked up as he ran toward the altar, and saw a great dragon with blood-red wings blotting out the sun as it circled overhead, until at last the dragon landed gracefully on top of the hill beside the sacred pool that overlooked the stone circle. The dragon's powerful frame was about the size of a large cottage, and his body was covered in dark crimson scales. His great claws tore into the earth, and his long neck arched upward as he raised his scaly horned head. It was then he became aware of the lone knight, Shadow, walking toward him.
Thrum, thrum. Again and again you wail and beat on the drum. But who is this who has not run? Who has come to challenge me?
He demanded in a great horrible voice that shook the entire valley. The Clove watched the Dark Knight hold his ground, standing between the dragon and the stone circle. Surely he was a fool, but the Clove couldn't help but admire his courage. The Clove panted heavily as he crept up over toward the stone columns. A small girl was chained to the pillar, but she didn't seem a bit frightened. "The knight will save us," she said. "I read it in a story once. He will save us." The Clove grimaced and picked up a heavy rock in both hands. "I think that's another story," he told her, and began smashing the rock against the iron ring until finally it gave way. The noise did not go unnoticed by the priests, and as the Clove went to the next pillar, a priest rushed over to recapture the girl. But while the Clove smashed the ring that held the next child, he heard the little girl that had been freed let out a panicked shout, which was quickly muffled when the priest cut her throat with his khopesh, killing her. The Clove let out a savage growl and hurled the stone at the priest, crushing the skull. Quick to avenge his brother, another priest leapt out from behind the stone archway. "Die, heathen!" the priest snarled as he brandished his khopesh, and the Clove nearly did, not once, but several times. With each pass of the strange, deadly blade, the Clove felt a metallic wind blast across his face, and then felt his own hot blood trickling down his ear and neck. He had been cut, but not deeply. He tried to grab the sword, but the priest was quicker. The Clove jumped back. "You missed!" The Clove taunted the priest, spreading his arms and standing square as if to give him a better target. The priest snarled again and pursued the Clove around the stone column. Ah! Sparks flew as the blade struck stone. The Clove suddenly doubled back, spinning across the flat edge of the blade, and grabbed the priest's sword arm and slammed his forehead into the stone pillar, dazing him for a moment, before shattering his elbow and wrenching the sword from his hand. The priest fell to the ground, howling in pain, and the Clove snarled as he pressed the blade to his neck, staring into his eyes. "Go meet death," he seethed. "Do it! I die serving the dragon!" The Clove spat in his face, and then ruthlessly, with the man's own sword, severed his head from his shoulders. The scent of blood reached the dragon's nostrils, and his blazing yellow eyes looked past Shadow and narrowed in on the warrior, who was still standing over the decapitated body of the priest. The Clove didn't stay still too long, as he quickly took his sword and began breaking the other chains.
Vile insect! Did you truly think you would get away with stealing from me? Well, my back is turned.
Shadow glanced over his shoulder to see the Clove staring right back at him. The Dark Knight acknowledged him with a somber nod and quickly dismounted, and then clashed his sword and shield together, taunting the dragon. Black smoke swirled through the dragon's sigh-like teeth as he laughed.
Thrum, thrum, won't this be fun?
The Clove glanced nervously over to Shadow, and then at the dragon's gaping jaws. The Black Knight just stood there. The Clove couldn't help but wonder, what the hell was Shadow doing? The dragon reared his head back, and before the Clove could shout a word in warning, the Dark Knight was engulfed in a raging flames, consuming him from head to toe. Black plumes of smoke billowed up as the fire scorched the earth, leaving nothing but barren ash and stone behind. There was a strong tinge of magic in the air, and as the wind blew the toxic fumes away, the people gasped to see the Dark Knight was still standing. The dragon roared and reared back once more, spilling another river of fire onto the night. But Shadow merely ducked back behind his enchanted shield, which emitted a faint blue aura that protected him from the swirling fire burning around him. The shield soon began to glow so hot the Clove had to avert his eyes to keep from being blinded by the light. But as before, when the smoke cleared, the knight still stood in the field of charred cinders, still unscathed. However, this time the metal on the edge of his shield was badly warped, and it glowed red as if it were fresh from the smithy's forge, and the patch of grass beneath him, once green, was now dried and yellow. When the great red dragon saw this, he laughed and spread his wings and flew down the hill, spewing fire and smoke, swooping down to tear the lone knight to shreds with his claws. When suddenly he felt a sudden pain tear through the membranes of his left leathery wing, causing him to veer off course and crash into the stone columns. While the dragon had been intent on attacking Shadow, Le Clove struck first and hurled his sword at the beast, piercing the sensitive, soft, thin membranes of its great wing. Once again, the dark knight appeared from the swirling smoke and the dying flames. Only this time he was bent over at his knees. The tip of his mighty sword was planted in the ground as he rested his head on the sword hilt. The clove ran into the charred field, but Shadow did not move. The steel plates of his armor glowed red with heat, and smoke rose from his visor, giving off the worst odor imaginable, the smell of burning flesh. The dragon slowly stirred, unleashing a horrible, pain-stricken roar, the likes of which had never been heard before. It shook every stone in the valley, right down to the marrow of his bones.
My wing! My wing! Oh! For this you'll die so very slow.
"Shadow, get up," the clove urged. "You damn fool, he's coming." The dark knight did not look up. He remained motionless. The clove tried to lift his visor, but it was too hot to touch. "Shadow," he repeated. Fear and then horror gripped him when he realized that what he was looking at was nothing more than a hollow suit of armor. The plates had been fused together. No bone remained inside. The smoldering, warped armor contained only ashes. A charred metal husk was all that was left. The clove turned his head and watched the dragon flop about lopsidedly in anguish as it dragged its mangled crimson wing behind him. Having thrown his own sword at the dragon, the clove was utterly defenseless. He attempted to pry Shadow's sword from his charred remains, but the metal was still scalding, and it burned his hands. "Ah!" Cursing, he pulled off his tunic and wrapped the fabric around the glowing sword hilt and pried it free from his comrade's empty, charred gauntlets. Black smoke swirled up from the glowing hot metal. "Ah!" The clove dropped the sword on the ground, cursing bitterly, for it was too hot to hold. When the dragon's eyes locked in on him, the clove felt his blood turn to ice. As the dragon reared back his head, Clove snatched up Shadow's mighty smoldering weapon and fled for his life. Just in time, he dove behind a large granite boulder as a wall of flame rushed toward him. He dropped the sword and huddled to the ground with his hands over his ears as a horrible rush of flames screamed past him like a banshee. Once the fire ended, toxic black fumes billowed up from the black scorched earth, stinging his eyes and burning his throat and nostrils. The dragon snarled vehemently as his angry yellow eyes searched through the black smoke for the man responsible for his torn wing.
Thrum, thrum, come on out. I likes them. Well done.
He spewed out another wall of fire, scorching the boulders until the earth glistened like glass, and the tops of the rocks hissed and smoldered. Black and gray plumes of smoke rolled upward, but this did little to expose the young warrior. In fact, it made it impossible to see anything, which infuriated the dragon all the more.
There's nothing I hate more than a cowardly thief,
He roared, but nothing stirred.
Thrum, please come out. I would hate for you to miss the fun.
The dragon turned, watching as the priest again chained the children to the stone columns. His cruel yellow eyes
Come
lit
on
up when he
out.
spotted the princess standing
I
upon
want
the sacrificial
you
altar.
to watch as I peel the flesh from your princess's bones.
He taunted. "Take her!" Leclos shouted from behind the still steaming boulder. "But leave the children be." The dragon's eyes narrowed into inquisitive slits as he searched through the thick smoke.
Bold words for a cowardly thief. Do you really think you can walk into my land and tell me what is mine?
It was then Princess Creela called out, "I am yours, great dragon prince. Please, I beg for the life of my father." The dragon let out a hiss as he turned to see the dark silhouette of a man standing in the haze of churning smoke. "My name is Leclos," he declared. "I come to you not as a thief, but a warrior. What I claim are spoils of war."
Then come and claim them,
snarled the dragon as he reared up and engulfed the silhouette in the deadly flames. However, when the fire faded, the figure stood silently in the smoke on the edge of the boulder field. The dragon stared, stunned to still see him alive. "Come and fight, coward!" Leclos shouted back. "I hear they call you a prince, but I think the other dragons drove you out. No, I think you fled. I think you wouldn't even fight for your throne, just like you won't fight me now."
You're full of words, but your weapons are useless. I am enthralling. I have lived for centuries. Do you think you are the first to come up against me? I have crushed armies with just one breath.
"Ha!" Leclos laughed. "Yet just one man took your wing. What armies do you speak of? I think you're a liar and a coward." The ground trembled and shook as Enthrallin roared in outrage.
I turned them into ashes on the wind, like your friend is, and like you will soon be.
But as the smoke cleared, Enthrallin looked closer and discovered that the silhouette he had been speaking to was just a pile of rocks stacked up to look like a man. Creela screamed in horror as a priest in red came around the stone column. Sensing the commotion, the dragon turned. But what he saw was not a priest. It was Leclos disguised in the red robe, wielding Shadow's glowing hot blade. Aiming for Enthrallin's heart, Leclos thrust the blade up and through the dragon's armored scales, and with a great and desperate growl, he drove the sword into the dragon's chest. Enthrallin roared in pain and reared up as he clawed at the burning sword. Suddenly, Leclos saw a flash of silver and felt a sharp, searing pain in his shoulder, causing him to stagger and fall. He looked back and saw, to his horror, the same green gem-studded dagger that the princess had used to cut the noose from around his neck, now sticking out of his shoulder. His yellow eyes flashed heatedly toward Creela, who glared down at him from the stone altar. Enthrallin's eyes followed Leclos over to the princess.
Stay out of this!
The princess screamed in terror as she was consumed in a hot blast of dragon fire, leaving nothing but ashes and billowing smoke rising from the altar. However, when Enthrallin turned to find Leclos, he only saw a crimson trail of fresh blood leading back toward the boulder field. The dragon's eyes narrowed in sharp slits as he noticed the blood bubble, hiss, and steam in the green grass.
I see you are a pyro.
He snarled, but then Enthrallin laughed as he pulled the sword from his chest. Not a drop of blood fell, for not only had he missed the heart, the hot metal had seared the wound. Bleeding heavily, Leclos fled across the charred ground into the cover of the large boulder field. He could hear the dragon coming after him, but there was nowhere to go.
You can't hide anymore, little pyro.
Enthrallin growled as he lumbered across the charred grassy field over to the granite stones. Leaning against a rock, Leclos looked up to the sky and let out a muffled curse as he pulled the princess's dagger from his shoulder. The dragon was close now, so he darted around a boulder and clambered onto a tall, rocky slope. Creela's dagger might have missed his heart, but the wound was still deep. Leclos, now shivering from the blood loss, could hear the dragon lurking beneath him. The dragon sidestepped around a boulder that had been marked with the crimson blood and growled.
Fire was too good for you. Now I'm going to feed on your flesh. Come out. If there's even 1 ounce of dragon blood, come out. But no, you hide like the sniveling whelp of a dog that you are.
Leclos braced himself against a large rock and shoved it over the ledge. It landed on Enthrallin's snout. The dragon snarled and reared up, shaking his head in a daze. Leclos leapt off the ledge on top of the dragon's head and savagely thrust Creela's dagger deep into its eye socket. Enthrallin let out an awful howl and slammed his head against the rock, sending Leclos skidding down the steep, slanted, rocky slope into a dark crevice. Landing in a heap, Leclos groaned and wondered what had possessed him to do something so rash and reckless. And then he looked at the dagger and saw the severed optic nerve dangling from the bloody yellow eye that stared back up at him. Leclos grinned as he looked at the grisly trophy in his hand, and fear melted away. The dragon may be immortal, but it still bled. Crimson blood hissed and steamed on the rocks from the red dragon's gruesome, empty eye socket.
Vile filth! You will pay! I swear upon Draco's line and all the stars in the sky, you will pay.
Enthrallin spun around, smashing rocks with his tail and spewing fire in every dark crevice where the pyro might be hiding.
Show yourself, you vile coward!
Enthrallin roared as he flipped over boulders and scored the rocks with his claws. When Leclove called out, "I'm here, Enthrallin, and I have your eye in my pocket if you want it back." Enraged, the dragon spun around and cocked his head, searching for his attacker with his good eye, when suddenly he saw a crimson flash of steel in the sunlight, and there was Leclove, covered in blood, holding out an empty hand out toward him. And that was the last thing Enthrallin ever saw, for the next image was a terrible sheet of red. Horrible pain erupted into his skull as a dagger pierced his other eye, completely blinding him. Unable to see a thing, the red dragon reeled about in utter darkness, writhing and shrieking as he flailed, and fled like an oversized rodent, desperately clambering over rocks as he made his way through the boulder field, scurrying back to his hidden cave in the valley. Pressing his hand over his wounds, Leclove let out a labored sigh of relief as he staggered back toward the stone altar. The priests had torn their red garments and began throwing ashes upon themselves, weeping and crying out, "All is lost! All is lost! Doom upon us all!" While other priests threw themselves on their own swords. Leclove, however, caught one before he could take his own life and ripped the ceremonial khopesh from his hands. The priest fell to his knees. "What would you have me do, my lord?" Leclove glared down at the priest covered in black ashes. "Nothing. I just wanted to do it myself." He struck the priest in the face with the flat edge of the curved blade, knocking him to the ground, and then thrust the sword into his gut, and finishing him with a cruel twist. The priest screamed in agony as he died, and Leclove glared back at the villagers who had gathered around to watch from a safe distance away. "Unchain these children, or I will burn your village to the ground myself, and I will sow your fields with salt until this land is barren and nothing grows." However, at that moment, he was struggling just to stay upright. As far as burning and pillaging went, he was more concerned about acquiring the sacred lily from the bloody dragon's sacred stupid pond. All this for a flower. End of part 12 of The Dragon Scourge. If you've liked what you've heard so far, I am entertaining some ideas about doing more audiobooks. You can contact me at thedragonscourge@gmail.com. If you would like to support this channel, the book is in Amazon and Kindle. Keep in mind, I am an independent writer, illustrator, and narrator, so not everything's going to be perfect or smooth as a big box professional with all the musical room and the sound equipment. All I got is a microphone and a small room that's quiet most of the time, and some sound effects.
Am I overdoing the deep vocal voice?
A little bit.
I don't know.
Yes, you are.
Maybe. I guess I can always try to talk normal, but everyone always kind of picked on me because I had a low voice.
Just read the freaking book! It's not that hard! People don't need overdramatic voiceover crap! Oops, do we have a bleep button or...
That was kind of mean.
I'm sorry. Oh, come on. Whose job is it to press the bleep button?
We don't have a bleep
We
button.
don't have one.
Yes. I mean, no, we don't have one.
Something that rhymes with rap.
I think you should lay
Zap.
off the coffee.
Tap.
No,
Cap.
we're not playing this game.
You get a cap. I don't know how they are gotten there.
I think you need a break.
Okay. Bye-bye.